So in this lecture, I'm going to talk about the reason why it is difficult to understand assembly instruction for beginner. As I stated previous time, motivation is important when you start to learn about the new topic. That can be applied to the situation when you start to run the assembly instruction. So first reason why it is challenging to run the assembly instruction for the beginner is too hard to understand the documentation of RISC-V architecture. So many of you are in the situation to start to run the CPU architecture, just like RISC-V architecture and ARM architecture in Intel x86 architecture. In that situation, the first thing you should do is to review the documentation, and for example, you may refer to the documentation of ARM reference text specification. And since you are interested in the RISC-V architecture, I'm sure that you may have reviewed RISC-V reference documentation. But I guess whenever you look into the reference documentation of each CPU architecture, the first chapter or the first topic in that reference documentation would be assembly instruction. But as for beginners, assembly instruction could be a significant barrier. So next slide, I'm going to explain more about why it is challenging to run the assembly instruction for the beginner. Every time you look into assembly instruction, or if you would like to read the reference document of the CPU architecture, you should realize that it only describes syntax of instruction. So most explanations are limited to description of instruction, like MV instruction and LD instruction and add-I instruction, and what the CPU reference document describe is similar to that of the data sheet that is provided by chipset maker. This is example of description of syntax of assembly instruction. As for this part of the content, and this is only representation of add-I assembly instruction. And then documentation of RISC-V reference is only describe some representation or description of each assembly instruction. The problem we face is that it is hard to figure out how these assembly instructions are used in a real project. And that is something that newbie system software engineers are looking for. Let's assume that you understand the description and representation of assembly instruction by reviewing this part of documentation. And it is, even though you mastered every part of content description of assembly instruction, and do you think that you can analyze assembly instruction in your real project? I think that it is hard to understand each assembly instruction right after you take a look at documentation of RISC-V reference specification, because in order to understand assembly routine, and you need to figure out how these assembly instructions are actually used in our real project. So understanding of reference documentation is important. I know that it is the first step to understand the assembly instruction, but it is not enough. So we need to examine example assembly routine, which consists of assembly instruction. So in this lecture, I talk about the first reason why it is challenging to run the assembly instruction for the new beginner entry-level system software engineer. The next lecture, I'm going to talk about another reason why it is hard to understand assembly instruction.